Colonel Elise Ward didn't speak. She didn't raise her voice. She just watched as a white cop searched her car without cause, mocked her silence, and caged her in handcuffs by the side of the road. But when he found her Army Colonel ID, he froze. His hands shook. His power crumbled. Why didn't she stop him sooner? Why did she let it happen until that exact moment? If you're already leaning in, like this video and drop a comment, because once the truth unfolds, you won't forget what she did next. Let's begin. They say some streets remember who's driven them. Elise Ward had no intention of leaving a mark. She just wanted to get home. The sun was low, the road nearly empty, and the only sound in her car was the quiet rhythm of her breath and the hum of the engine. She wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving. She was just driving slow and steady through a suburban street where porch lights had already started to flicker on. She looked like someone with a purpose, but no need to prove it. Then the lights hit her. Red and blue exploded in her rearview mirror, washing across her face like a sudden storm. Elise didn't startle. She didn't even blink. Her jaw tightened slightly as she eased the car to the curb. Hands stayed on the wheel. Her gaze didn't shift, but the stillness in her eyes sharpened. She knew this wasn't about traffic. Officer Brent Larkin stepped out of the cruiser like he owned the zip code. Heavy boots, broad frame, that unmistakable posture, not of someone enforcing the law, but someone eager to remind you who gets to define it. He approached the window, fast, tapped twice on the glass, firm, impatient. License and registration, he snapped before she could roll it down fully. Elise didn't rush. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She lowered the window, turned to him, and said, "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer? You were driving below the speed limit. That's not normal around here. You looked uncertain. Is that illegal? It's suspicious." There it was. The word. Suspicious. So easy to use, so hard to undo. Elise nodded once. "My license is in my jacket. May I reach for it?" Larkin gave her a tight, dismissive nod. "Go ahead. Slow." She retrieved the ID, handed it to him. He didn't look at the name. Not really. His eyes scanned the address and photo, but he wasn't interested in who she was. Only in who he decided she must be. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. There was no please, no explanation, just assumption. Elise paused, just long enough to let the moment breathe. Then she unlocked the door and stepped out with composure that didn't match the setting. Larkin motioned her toward the hood of her car. "Hands where I can see 'em." Elise placed them on the metal column, controlled, but something had shifted. The temperature, the silence, the air. Larkin glanced into the back seat, saw a neatly folded green duffel bag. "What's in the bag?" "Personal items." "You military?" "I don't have to answer that." He stepped closer, voice rising. "This is a stop and search. You fit a description." Elise turned her head just slightly and looked him in the eye. "Of what?" Larkin didn't answer. He leaned into the car without consent, peering harder now, as if determined to find something that could justify the way this encounter had started. Elise stood still, watching him. Then quietly, she reached down under the console near the seat. Her thumb pressed a small recessed button. No beep, no light, no sound. But miles away, a system lit up. Signal sent to Homeland Emergency Liaison. Larkin didn't notice. He was too busy circling the car, adrenaline building from a threat he couldn't name, because it wasn't coming from her fists or voice. It was her silence. It rattled him. "You live around here?" he asked suddenly. "No." "What brings you through this neighborhood?" "I didn't know I needed permission," he sneered, stepping closer. "Don't get smart with me. You think that attitude's gonna help?" "I'm not trying to help you," she replied, voice even. That hit him. Not like an insult, like a mirror. Larkin's jaw flexed. He looked back toward his cruiser. Jamie Ruiz, the rookie, had just exited and was approaching slowly, sensing the tension. Young, brown-skinned, alert, but clearly uncertain. "You good, sir?" Jamie asked carefully. "She's being uncooperative," Larkin muttered. Elise's eyes never left Larkin. "I've followed every instruction you gave. You followed them like you were doing me a favor." The words hung in the air. That's when Jamie looked at Elise. Really looked. Not as a suspect, but as someone who wasn't afraid, and probably for a reason. Elise turned her head, slightly locked eyes with the young officer. There was no fear in her expression, only this quiet, weighty question. "What happens when the wrong person thinks they have the right power?" Jamie didn't answer, because in that moment even he felt it. Something was off. And this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Larkin circled the vehicle like a man who didn't quite know what he was looking for, but had already decided he'd find it. Elise remained exactly where she'd been told to stand, hands visible, back straight, eyes forward. Yet her presence alone seemed to scratch at something inside him. Maybe it was how still she was. Maybe it was how unbothered she looked, like she'd measured this situation long before he pulled her over and knew exactly how it would go. "Pop the trunk," he ordered. She didn't ask why. Didn't challenge the legality of the request. She just turned, walked back to the driver's side with the same calm precision, reached inside and pressed the release. The trunk opened with a soft click. Larkin strode over and raised the lid fully, one hand resting on his belt. Inside, nestled neatly beside a pair of clean boots and a folded windbreaker, was a military-style duffel bag. Olive green, heavy canvas, issued, not bought. On top of it, tucked carefully into one corner, was a small box, dark blue, velvet-lined, sealed. He picked it up like it was cheap. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked, shaking it slightly. Elise didn't answer. "Medals awards. Or just something you bought online to play dress-up." Still nothing. Larkin turned, holding the box loosely in his hand. "You got a lot of nerve walking around with military gear like this if you haven't earned it." Elise's expression didn't change. No twitch of the mouth. No hardening of the brow. She simply met his stare and waited. That was when Jamie Ruiz stepped closer, still keeping a respectful distance. He hadn't said much since arriving. It wasn't his stop. He was backup. That's what they told him in training: observe, support, don't get ahead of the lead officer. But something about this didn't sit right. The way Larkin spoke to her. The way she stood like she'd been here before and didn't flinch anymore. He cleared his throat gently. "Sir, that bag, it looks standard issue." Larkin turned to him with a half laugh, half snarl. "You've been in long enough to know what standard issue looks like, Ruiz." Jamie paused. "No, sir." "Then keep watching." Jamie said nothing, but he glanced back at Elise, and this time she was looking at him. Directly. No smile, no challenge, just something steady, almost questioning. It unsettled him. He shifted on his feet. Larkin tossed the box back into the trunk louder than necessary. The sound echoed a little too sharp in the quiet street. "You know," he said, brushing dust off his hands, "folks, like you think silence gives you control." Still no response. He stepped closer, lowering his voice now as if trying to provoke something private. "You think not talking makes you superior, untouchable. That stare of yours like you're above all this." Elise tilted her head just slightly. Not enough to be defiant. Just enough to say, "I see what you're doing, and I'm not impressed." That moment landed heavier than if she'd shouted. Jamie felt it. It was in the way the air felt a little tighter, the way Larkin's fingers curled near his holster, not because he needed to use it, but because he didn't know what else to do with his failure to intimidate her. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Larkin muttered, stepping back. "Just say what I expect and we both move on." "I don't owe you expectations," Elise said quietly. It was the only line she offered since stepping out of the car. But it shifted everything, because it wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, with the voice of someone who'd spent a lifetime being expected to explain herself, and had finally decided that silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Jamie's eyes flicked between them, unsure of where this was going, only knowing it had passed the point of routine long ago. Larkin didn't respond, not right away. He paced a half step, then zipped the duffel closed with unnecessary force and slammed the trunk. "You're lucky I haven't cited you yet," he said, voice sharper than before. "You're not helping yourself." Elise raised an eyebrow. "Was that your goal?" "To make me help myself." There was no sarcasm, no venom, just a quiet unraveling of his authority. And it worked. Larkin walked away without replying, mumbling under his breath. Jamie stood frozen. Elise turned back toward her car, slow, calm, every step calculated. He didn't know who she was, but she did, and that made all the difference. It was subtle at first, the way things shifted. Not the kind of shift you notice until it's already past the point of no return. Larkin had circled back to Elise, jaw tight, breath clipped. You could see it in the way he walked now, faster, sharper, like he needed to re-establish control before it slipped completely from his grip. "Face the hood," he snapped. Elise didn't move right away. She just looked at him, head straight, eyes steady, not rebellious, not apologetic, just steady. Like she knew the storm had already started and had no intention of flinching under the first drop of rain. Larkin stepped closer. "I said face the hood." Slowly, Elise turned and placed her hands on the cool metal. The street was still quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin and makes everything louder. Even the sound of a glove stretching as Larkin adjusted it. Even the small crackle of the radio on his belt. Then came the shove. It wasn't a violent one, not outwardly, but it was sharp enough to send her chest against the hood with a dull thud. Quick enough to say, "I'm in charge and I want you to remember it." Jamie Ruiz stiffened behind them. He had been standing closer to the cruiser, unsure whether he should step in or stay quiet. His training didn't cover moments like this. Not really. The handbook said de-escalate when appropriate, but no one ever explained what to do when the problem wasn't the suspect, it was your partner. "Sir," Jamie started, voice low, unsure. "She's not resisting," he added a second later, a little louder. Larkin didn't even turn around. "She's being non-compliant," he snapped. "That's enough for probable cause." Jamie opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at Elise. Her face turned slightly to the side, one cheek grazing the hood. Her hands still exactly where she'd put them. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just stayed where she was, like she'd lived this moment in some other city, on some other street, in some other decade. Larkin reached for the cuffs, and that's when she spoke. Not loudly, not as a plea, just a calm, quiet statement that cut deeper than anything she could have screamed. "You didn't ask who I am," she said. "You assumed what I should be." Larkin hesitated. Just a second. But the moment stretched longer than it should have. He locked one cuff on her right wrist, then the other. His hands were steady, but his jaw had tensed, the kind of tension that doesn't come from anger, but from being seen too clearly. Jamie looked again. There was something off. The way Elise stood, the way she held her body even while restrained, it didn't read like submission. It read like discipline, control, like someone who'd been trained to stay still under pressure. And then Jamie saw it. Peeking out from beneath the collar of her shirt, half covered by the edge of her jacket, was a name patch. Dark thread, military font. It said Ward. His eyes dropped to the left side of her jacket. A faded insignia, just enough to catch the sunlight. It wasn't flashy, wasn't a fashion statement. It looked earned. Elise turned her head slightly, not enough to challenge, just enough to make sure Jamie had seen it. And he had. Larkin hadn't. Or if he had, he wasn't ready to admit it. He scoffed. "You wear that for effect, trying to look like something you're not." He said it too fast, too sharp, because even he knew deep down that patch wasn't from a costume shop. Elise didn't answer. She didn't need to, because silence when held like that doesn't surrender. It accuses. Larkin stepped back, lips tight, eyes flaring with something he wasn't ready to name. Uncertainty, maybe. Or fear. But before he could say anything else, Elise did something that shifted the whole street. She looked past him, not at Jamie, not at the car, but past them both. Her head turned toward the far end of the road, her eyes locking on something unseen, like she was waiting, expecting. Not surprised, just aware. Jamie followed her gaze. The street was still empty. But there was something about the way she watched it, the way her body shifted slightly, like someone who had just heard the first rumble of a storm before the sky changes. Larkin turned too. Nothing. At least not yet. But the energy shifted. He felt it. Jamie felt it. Even Elise's stillness felt more deliberate. And in that quiet, in that charged space between confrontation and consequence, Jamie began to realize something he hadn't been taught in training. This wasn't just a woman who'd been stopped. This was someone who had chosen not to reveal who she was. Not out of fear, but out of choice. And if that choice was starting to run out of time, then so was everyone else standing on that street. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street in harsh pulses, but everything else felt unnaturally still. Then, without warning, a large black SUV rolled to a stop just beyond Elise's car. The engine didn't cut. It kept idling low, a deep mechanical hum that pressed against the silence like a held breath. Officer Larkin turned, one hand instinctively resting near his hip. The door of the SUV opened slowly. Out stepped a tall black man in a dark wool coat, broad-shouldered, with a quiet authority that didn't come from noise or speed. He didn't look at Larkin, didn't speak. Instead, he walked straight to Officer Jamie Ruiz and held out a sealed envelope. Jamie hesitated, glancing over at Larkin, who gave a scoffing laugh but didn't object. The seal bore an embossed federal insignia. Nothing flashy, just official in a way that made Jamie's fingers tense. He peeled it open. His eyes scanned the top line and froze. "Colonel Elise Ward," he whispered under his breath. "U.S. Army Intelligence Division. Active security clearance. Tier 1. For a moment, Jamie didn't breathe. His training hadn't covered this. Not the traffic stop of a sitting army colonel with live intelligence clearance. Behind him, Larkin barked a laugh. Right. And I'm the Secretary of Defense. You guys fall for this garbage, they all print up something shiny now. Jamie didn't respond. He read it again, slower this time. The document included a federal clearance number, a QR code, and internal routing credentials. Nothing looked fabricated. Nothing felt exaggerated. He looked up at Elise. Her expression hadn't changed. No defense. No urgency. Just silence. Larkin snatched the envelope from Jamie's hand and waved it toward Elise like it was nothing more than junk mail. What, you think this gets you out of a traffic violation? He snapped, lifting the paper toward the street lamp. You don't speak, so now this speaks for you. Still no reaction from Elise. But something in her stillness now carried weight, like it wasn't the silence of submission, but the restraint of someone giving him just enough rope. Jamie's gaze drifted to the rear seat of Elise's car. The trunk was still open from earlier, and that same small velvet box barely noticed before sat undisturbed. On instinct, he stepped closer. He knelt and opened the lid carefully. Inside was a single metal round and gold-edged resting on deep blue velvet. Not the kind you buy online, not a service ribbon or public commendation. This was something else entirely, something rare. Jamie tilted his head. His grandfather had been in the army. Jamie had grown up learning the difference between everyday insignia and something earned in classified missions. This looked like one of those. He glanced back at Elise, who stood quietly, wrists still cuffed in front of her. She met his gaze directly. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't desperate. But there was something in her eyes, something that felt more like a dare than a plea. She wasn't asking for their approval. She was watching what they would do with the truth now that it was in front of them. The wind picked up slightly, lifting the edge of Elise's coat. Jamie noticed a faded name tape sewn just inside the lapel, Ward E. Next to it, the faint stitching of a former deployment location, Kandahar. Jamie's stomach turned. Larkin, still holding the paper, waved it at Mason now. Where'd you print this? He snapped. You people think adding a QR code makes it legit. Mason remained silent. His arms stayed at his sides, body still. But the way he stood, shoulders square, jaw tight, made it clear this was not a man used to backing down. Then, without a word, Mason turned and walked back to the SUV. He didn't look at Elise. He didn't speak. But Elise, for the first time since the stop began, let her posture soften. Barely. Like a signal only someone who knew her would notice. Jamie saw it. He didn't understand it yet, but he saw it. Elise stood not like a woman caught in trouble, but like a soldier waiting for command to shift. And maybe, just maybe, the moment she'd been waiting for hadn't even arrived yet. Elise didn't move when Jamie unclasped the cuffs. Her arms slowly dropped to her sides, but there was no rubbing of wrists, no flinching. Just silence. And from that silence came the kind of presence that made the air feel thinner, heavier. Then came her voice, low, precise, deliberate. Officer Larkin, she said, you need to step back. Larkin laughed, a harsh, nervous chuckle that cracked in the middle. Step back, lady. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Elise turned to face him fully now. Her eyes didn't blink. Yes, she said, unfortunately. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because in that moment, Elise wasn't a woman demanding respect. She was reclaiming a space she'd never surrendered in the first place. She reached into her coat with the same calm you'd use to adjust a collar. Slowly, without haste. From the inner lining, she retrieved a slim leather case, aged and worn, but clearly kept with reverence. Jamie watched her hands, and something in his gut told him not to breathe. Elise flipped open this case, revealing a military identification badge set in polished silver. The crest of the United States Army. Intelligence Division. Below it, her full name, Colonel Elise A. Ward. Status active. Clearance Tier 1. She placed the badge down on the hood of her car, right where the citation pad had been moments ago. It glinted under the afternoon sun like a blade drawn slow. Larkin stepped forward out of habit, but when he saw what was on that badge, he froze mid-stride. He leaned in closer. Then his face changed from smug confusion to disbelief to something that sat between shame and fear. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered. No, that's got to be a fake. Jamie took a step closer, catching a glimpse of the encoded chip embedded in the ID, a security signature only top-level clearance personnel carried. "No, sir," Jamie said, his voice quiet. "That's real." Larkin's lips parted, but no sound came out. He reached out, maybe to touch the badge, maybe to snatch it, but pulled back like it might burn his skin. Elise finally stepped forward, then slow and steady. She leaned in just enough so her voice could cut through the rising wind. "You violated protocol. You ignored procedure. You handled me like a threat. But the only threat in this situation," she said, eyes narrowing, "is your ignorance." Larkin's nostrils flared. He opened his mouth to speak, but Elise wasn't done. "You searched for control." She continued, her voice low but merciless, "but all you found was the edge of your own incompetence." The street, once so still, now carried a strange tension. Even the wind seemed to pause. Jamie couldn't take his eyes off the badge. It sat like a silent verdict between them all. Larkin took a half step back, suddenly, unsure of where he stood literally and figuratively. His authority, once wielded like a blunt weapon, now hung limp and useless in his hand. Then the moment snapped. A gust of wind ripped the citation from Larkin's clipboard, flinging it into the air. It danced like paper fleeing a battlefield, flipping and twisting before disappearing down the street. No one chased it. Elise stepped back from the hood. Her fingers brushed against the badge, not to take it, but to straighten it. She left it gleaming in place, a reminder. Then, for the first time, she looked to Jamie. Not with disdain or disappointment, but with something more complex, measured, almost human. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," she said quietly. "But there are moments when silence isn't grace. It's mercy." She turned. Mason was waiting by the open door of the SUV. He hadn't spoken a word since he arrived, but his stance said everything he knew this version of Elise well, the one who fought wars without raising her voice. As she stepped into the vehicle, Larkin muttered just above a whisper, "Why didn't you just say something?" The door was halfway shut when she paused. Her eyes met his one last time. "Because people like you," she said, "don't listen. You look, you judge, you act, and then you regret." Click. The door closed. The SUV pulled away without urgency, moving down the street like nothing had happened at all. Except everything had. Larkin remained there, statue still, watching the vehicle disappear. His chest rose and fell in uneven waves. Jamie stood beside him, eyes locked on the badge, left behind the one thing more honest than anything Larkin had written on that pad. And in that stillness, with the wind slowly dying, the silence left behind said more than 1,000 accusations. It said you chose the wrong one, and she let you find out the hard way. It wasn't until much later, long after Elise's SUV had vanished down the quiet suburban road, that Jamie Ruiz found himself still standing there, unsure of what exactly had just unfolded. His partner was pacing behind him, muttering curses half under his breath, still rattled, still trying to find something, anything to claw back a sense of control. But it was gone. All of it. Jamie didn't say much. He just stared at the badge still sitting on the hood of Elise's car. The reflection of the sky caught in its edges until he finally reached into his vest and pressed the button on his body cam. He watched it blink red. Recording ended. Back at the precinct, the footage was already uploading to the internal system. Standard procedure. But something in Jamie wouldn't let it sit there untouched. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him. Not with anger, not even with disappointment. It was something quieter, something heavier. It felt like responsibility. Later that night, he sat alone at his desk, eyes fixed on the screen as the video played again. Elise's face was calm, not smug, not cold, just grounded, steady, the kind of quiet you don't fake. From the moment Larkin pulled her from the car to the second she was uncuffed, she hadn't flinched. She didn't plead. She didn't protest. She didn't even blink too fast. She stood like someone who had walked through worse and knew this wasn't the end of anything. Jamie paused the footage, rewound, and watched it again. Then he did something that he wasn't entirely sure was wise. He clicked download, and then he typed a name into his phone. Maya Kingston, freelance journalist, local, fierce, and not afraid to poke the bear. They'd known each other back in college. She covered stories the big stations wouldn't touch. Not always clean, not always comfortable, but always true. "You up?" he texted. She replied almost instantly. "Always." "What do you have?" He didn't explain. Just sent the file. Then, watch it. That's all I'll say. It took less than 15 minutes. The next morning, Elise's name was everywhere. But it wasn't the rank that went viral. It wasn't the ID badge or the medals. It wasn't even the fact that she outranked the officers who had put hands on her. It was the look. Still frame after still frame the moment she turned her head and stared straight into the body cam just after being thrown against the hood. Just after Larkin had sneered something beneath his breath. No anger, no fear, just eyes. Eyes that didn't forgive. The headline on Maya's blog read, "Colonel Elise Ward never flinched," and that's what terrified them. By noon, national outlets had picked it up. By evening, it was being played side by side with other infamous footage, the kind with screaming, with chaos, with pain and panic. This one was different. She didn't scream, said one commentator on a live stream. She didn't resist. She just stood. And in that stillness, she told the truth. Clips were shared everywhere. People cut out the moment she slowly laid the badge down. The way Larkin's voice cracked. The gust of wind stealing his ticket book. The silence. The hashtag started late that night. She did not flinch. /power. In silence. Colonel Ward. Some saw it as the ultimate act of discipline. Others called it chilling. Many admitted they couldn't stop watching it, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was surgical. It was composed. It was proof that power didn't have to shout to be heard. One tweet in particular stood out. She didn't fight back. She let the world watch him crumble. That's leadership. Jamie saw it all unfold from the corner of his kitchen that night, sitting with a glass of water he hadn't touched. He kept replaying the last thing Elise had said before she drove off. Because people like you don't listen. He had wanted to argue with that, to defend himself. But now, as her face looped endlessly on his screen, he knew she hadn't meant it as an insult. She meant it as a warning, and she'd been right. Down at the precinct, Larkin wasn't saying much. Word was Internal Affairs had scheduled a review. The badge had disappeared from the hood. Someone had quietly returned it to Elise through official channels. No statement from her. No interviews. Just silence. And yet somehow that silence echoed louder than any press conference. By sunrise, the clip had already circled the country 3 times. No headlines were needed. Just the still frame of Elise Ward, standing unshaken gaze, sharp silver badge catching the sun, and the caption, "She didn't flinch." At the precinct, Officer Brent Larkin sat in a locked room, stripped of his weapon, his belt, and the illusion of invincibility he once carried like a second skin. Internal Affairs didn't even need to ask questions, yet the footage had done more damage than any interrogation could. It wasn't just what he did. It was how calm she stayed while he unraveled. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was judgment. Down the hall, Officer Jamie Ruiz sat on the edge of a bench outside the disciplinary office, elbows on his knees, fingers laced tight. He hadn't slept. Hadn't spoken much either. Someone had told him he was on administrative leave. Another said he'd breached protocol. But when he checked his phone, his inbox was flooded. "You were the only one who blinked. That woman's strength, we saw it because of you. You're not like him. Thank you." A reporter he vaguely knew from college had already left him 3 voicemails. One message just said, "Your cruiser cam woke up a nation," but not everyone was grateful. His supervisor warned him the department was reviewing the leak internally. There were rumors of possible charges. Jamie tried to explain he hadn't leaked anything. He'd just shared the truth. But truth is tricky when it makes people uncomfortable. And right now, the entire department was uncomfortable. By mid-morning, Larkin had officially been suspended. Without pay. Pending federal investigation. Reporters started circling his house. Protesters had already been outside the courthouse by noon, not shouting, not angry, just silent, holding signs with her face, holding signs with his face. And Elise, no press conferences, no interviews, not even a social media post. Her phone went unanswered. Her home stayed dark. And every time a new camera crew tried to find her, they left with nothing but guesses. Some thought it was fear. Others believed it was strategy. But most people saw it for what it was. Command. She didn't chase the moment. She controlled it. On national news, panelists debated everything from excessive force to the quiet dignity of military training. A retired Army general was asked about Elise. He cleared his throat and said, "I can't comment on operational officers. But I'll say this, some of the most powerful people I ever met never raised their voices. They didn't need to." The host leaned forward. "Are you saying she's still active?" He smiled. "I'm saying you're asking the wrong questions." By the time the Department of Defense issued their statement, "We do not confirm or deny the service status of any individual within military intelligence operations," the internet had already declared her a symbol. They called her the Colonel of Calm. They called her the woman who didn't blink. They called her the Eye of the Storm. Hashtags surged, power in silence. She did not flinch, officer exposed. But behind closed doors, some people weren't celebrating. In a quiet government building outside D.C., a woman in a gray suit watched the clip again. Then she leaned back, steepled her fingers, and whispered. She warned them, and they didn't listen. She picked up a phone and made a call. "Begin protocol shadow review. We may need to fast-track the declassification." Back at the precinct, Jamie was escorted into a back room where a senior official from Internal Affairs waited. The man didn't introduce himself. "You released department property," he said flatly. Jamie nodded. "You breached chain of command." Jamie said nothing. The man leaned in. "Why'd you do it?" Jamie stared back, voice low but steady. "Because I saw a woman get humiliated for doing nothing. Because I saw a man crumble in the face of dignity. And because if I didn't let the world see that, we'd still be pretending she was the problem." The room went silent. Then the man leaned back and said, "You're not off the hook. But we're not the ones writing history now." That afternoon, a civil rights lawyer gave a televised interview. She held up a still image of Elise being handcuffed. "This," she said, "is what happens when people think silence is weakness. What they don't understand is that real power doesn't shout. It watches, it waits, and then it acts without ever breaking its own code." Later that evening, a mural appeared overnight on a downtown wall. Elise mid-turn, silver badge in her hand, whined in her coat. Underneath in paint that looked like it had been brushed on with purpose, 5 words. She didn't flinch. "We rise." And as the sun set, somewhere far from cameras, Elise sat alone in her home. She hadn't spoken. But her silence was no longer absence. It was a storm. Still gathering, still coming. The video wasn't just a spark anymore. It had become a slow-moving wave washing across classrooms, newsrooms, squad rooms, and kitchen tables in places Elise had never stepped foot. The clip didn't need narration. No dramatic music. Just the simple, jarring truth of a woman standing still while the world tried to make her move. In a small high school in Indianapolis, Ms. Carter, a social studies teacher with silver hair and a patient voice, paused the projector and faced her students. "What does quiet courage look like?" she asked, her finger tapping the still image on the screen. Elise. Ward back straight arms behind her, her eyes locked on a man twice her size. The classroom was silent for a moment. Then a girl in the second row whispered, "Like her." Another boy nodded. She didn't even need to speak, and still they couldn't touch her. Later that week, that same classroom wall bore a new drawing charcoal on faded paper of Elise standing before 2 officers. The eyes, though rough and unfinished, somehow pierced through the paper. Above the sketch were the words, "She saw everything," and stayed standing. In another corner of the country, a young boy from Georgia took his crayons and drew his own version. Elise stood in the middle, flanked by faceless men in uniform. Her hands were not raised in protest. They were simply still. And in the sky above her head, he'd written the words in bold green, "She didn't run." That image made its way to a community board online, then to a morning news segment, then to a muralist in Detroit who painted a 6-foot version across the side of an abandoned building. No name, no fanfare. Just a single phrase written in white. She stood still. The door where she was stopped, that quiet street corner once forgettable, had become a gathering point. People began leaving flowers, notes, medals, poems folded into small envelopes. Someone hung a hand-painted sign that read, "For every time they tried to break her and failed." A retired police captain from Massachusetts mailed a handwritten letter to the editor of a national paper. It wasn't meant to be published, but someone did anyway. The letter read, "I spent 26 years training men to hold the line. We taught how to command a room, how to read a suspect, how to de-escalate with words, and when necessary with force. But we never taught what to do when faced with grace under fire. We never taught how to respond to someone who holds authority without needing to prove it. Elise Ward didn't just hold her ground. She exposed the cracks in ours. We've been training for power, not for how to hold it with humility. Across social media, people began sharing stories, moments where they'd chosen to stay still, to speak with silence, to let calm dismantle chaos. They weren't calling it resistance. They were calling it reflection. They were saying, "She gave us permission to be still and be powerful anyway." And in some places, it stirred more than just admiration. A small-town police chief in Ohio called a mandatory meeting for his department. He stood in front of the group, holding up a still image from the video. Not the moment of confrontation, but the moment right after Elise had been uncuffed where she walked away without a glance back. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we were never taught to fear silence, but maybe it's time we start listening to it." Not everyone agreed. There were still corners of the country where Elise was dismissed, where her silence was twisted into arrogance, where people said she should have spoken up, explained herself, softened her stare, shown more gratitude when released. But even there, something had shifted. People weren't dismissing her because they didn't understand. They were dismissing her because she made them uncomfortable, and discomfort, as history showed, was always the first sign of change. Meanwhile, Elise remained quiet. She didn't respond to the murals, didn't comment on the artwork. She didn't post any messages or accept the growing requests for interviews. She just kept going. But that didn't mean she didn't see it. Colonel Mason. Her husband found her one evening staring at a printed screenshot left on their doorstep. It was the drawing of her from the classroom, the charcoal version, raw and unfinished. She said nothing for a long time, just stared at it with an unreadable expression. Finally, she whispered, "They see me. But they don't know yet what they're seeing." Mason asked, "Then what should they know?" She turned her voice steady, "That this wasn't my loudest moment. It was just the only one they caught on tape." And with that, she folded the drawing once, then again, tucked it gently into a drawer, and went back to her quiet routine. The ripples kept moving outward, inward, reshaping the silence into something larger than anyone expected. And it was only just beginning. The hearing room wasn't built for moments like this. It had all the trappings of formality, dark wood panels, dull carpet, nameplates lined in a row, but none of the soul. And that morning, the air inside felt strained, like even the walls were waiting to see which side the weight would fall on. Elise sat alone at the long table in the center. No uniform, no legal counsel. Just her and the silence she had carried since day one. A silence that now echoed louder than any protest chant or shouted slogan. Across from her sat a panel of 7. Some wore discomfort like it was stitched into their suits. Others leaned back, arms crossed, already deciding who they thought she was. They played the body cam footage again, slowed down, dissected. Her stillness. Her eyes. The moment Larkin froze when the badge caught sunlight. The sound of her voice, calm but sharp, rising only once. "You didn't ask who I am. You assumed what I should be." The clip ended. No reaction. Just the soft scrape of paper being shifted. Then the voice came, measured, old, lined with power that had long gone unchallenged. Councilman Ron Pierce adjusted his tie and leaned toward the mic. "Colonel Ward," he began, though the title sat bitter in his mouth. "Would you agree that had you simply cooperated from the start, this entire incident could have been avoided?" Elise didn't blink. Pierce continued. "By withholding your identity until the moment most humiliating to the officer, you escalated the situation. Some might say you used your rank as a sword, turned it into a moment of theater." He leaned back like he'd dropped something heavy on the table. The room went quiet. Elise didn't rush to respond. She folded her hands, glanced briefly toward the back where Mason sat, then spoke clear, unwavering. "You think silence is performance?" she asked, more curious than angry. "You think restraint is manipulation?" She leaned forward just enough. "If my rank humiliated them," she said, "it wasn't because I used it. It's because they didn't expect someone like me to have it." Pierce opened his mouth, but she cut through. "You want to talk escalation? That man put me in cuffs without cause, pushed me onto the hood of my own car, ignored protocol, ignored warning signs, ignored everything but his own assumption." Her voice didn't rise, but her words hit like thunder rolling underfoot. I didn't escalate. I endured. There's a difference. A few rows back, someone whispered, "Damn right." Pierce's face flushed. He shifted in his seat, but before he could speak again, another panelist cut in. Judge Miriam Leland, eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. "Colonel Ward," she said, quieter but firmer, "did you intentionally wait to reveal your identity at the precise moment?" Officer Larkin applied force. Elise nodded once. "Yes," she replied. "I waited until I had no other choice, because I needed them and you to feel the full weight of the assumption made about me, not to punish, to expose." Leland studied her for a long beat, then looked down, said nothing. Pierce scoffed under his breath. So this was... What a demonstration. Elise turned toward him now, voice as steady as stone. "No. This was my life. This was what happens when people in power see skin before rank, a badge before truth. I've spent decades protecting this country. I don't need to perform justice. I live it." Another silence fell. But this time it wasn't awkward, it was loaded. Like the room knew it had just shifted. And then, a sound from the public gallery. One person stood, an older black man in a suit. He didn't clap. He just stood, arms folded, eyes locked on Elise. Then another stood beside him. Then another. Within seconds, half the room was on their feet. No applause, no cheering, just presence. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. Pierce looked around, visibly shaken by how quickly the room had slipped beyond his control. Elise stood too. She picked up the sealed folder she'd never opened, tapped it once against her palm, and looked straight at the panel. "I'm not here to reclaim dignity," she said. "I never lost it." She didn't wait for dismissal. She walked to the back of the room, slow, composed, every step sounding louder than the one before it. And just before she reached the door, she stopped. Not to speak, but to look back. Not at Pierce, not at the cameras, but at the officers still seated in silence, those who hadn't stood. Her gaze held them in place, not accusing, just undeniable. Then she walked out. Outside, the air was clearer, the wind a little stronger. No reporters called after her. They didn't need to. She'd already said everything she had to. And as the door shut behind her, one of the board members muttered softly under his breath, not even realizing his mic was still live. "That wasn't a hearing," he said. "That was a reckoning." No press release ever announced her departure. No staged interview aired at prime time. Elise Ward simply faded from public view the way a storm rolls out after it's broken everything open. One morning she was on every screen, every headline, every whisper in the corners of power, and then she wasn't. There were no photos of her after the hearing, no statements, no tweets, no profile to follow or comment under. If you searched her name now, what you'd find wasn't new footage or press junkets, but stories, unverified, unpolished, passed down like legend in rooms where people still cared about right and wrong. And maybe that was the point. Jamie Ruiz never got a chance to speak to her again. She didn't leave a note, didn't offer closure. But months later, when the department offered him a promotion and a safer post, he turned it down. Instead, he requested a transfer to the academy. The first day he stood in front of a new class of recruits, most of them barely old enough to remember what they'd watched go viral. He didn't open with procedure or chain of command. He didn't recite statutes or mission statements. He just wrote a question on the board. What will you do if the person you're ordered to detain is the one who fought for your right to breathe free? The room went quiet and stayed quiet. And that silence, it wasn't empty. It was searching. At the back of the classroom, just above the coat hooks, hung a photo. You wouldn't recognize her face. Because it wasn't her face. It was a still frame from that infamous footage, Elise standing beside her car wrists. Free eyes locked on a man whose authority had just shattered. The sunlight had caught her badge just right, and the gleam off the silver crest had flared like a mirror into the lens. They had cropped everything else out. Just light. Just metal. Just the weight of presence that couldn't be denied. Some recruits asked who she was. Jamie never said her name out loud. He just pointed and replied, "The one who didn't flinch." And somewhere in that quiet, her story kept moving. A small brass plaque now sits beside the old road where it all began. Not on a pedestal, not fenced off, just nestled into the concrete curb right where the SUV had once stopped. It doesn't scream or explain, doesn't mention ranks or accusations. There's no QR code, no date, no monument, just a single engraved line. The moment you raised your voice, she stayed still, and history heard her. And those who pass by, they pause. Not because they recognize the place, but because something in those words tugs at a place deeper than memory. It reminds them of something they haven't been able to name, about dignity, about restraint, about what it means to carry power and choose not to use it just to win. There are some who still argue about her. Online threads that spiral into politics. Articles that call her reckless or dangerous, or too silent for someone with so much weight to her name. But those voices, loud as they try to be, never last long. Because her story isn't one that shouts back. It waits, it lingers, it looks you in the eye. And for those who were paying attention, it changed something. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the quiet decision to stand still. Because sometimes the most powerful step isn't forward. It's walking away without needing to explain why you were never the one on trial. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that doesn't need to be loud. Elise Ward didn't yell. She didn't beg. She stood still and made an entire system tremble. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was clarity. It was control. And it reminded all of us that real strength doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it walks away in quiet dignity. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we share these moments, not just to inspire, but to remind you, justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands still and lets the world catch its breath. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who still believes in honor and restraint. And hit subscribe to hear more powerful stories just like this one. Your support gives our team the strength to keep creating meaningful content stories that leave something behind after the screen goes dark. Thank you for being here. This is Mr. Mac's Stories, where silence can still speak volumes.